This is not the time for government to brush aside your struggles and cling to the status quo. We need to face the facts and strike a better balance.
It's the biggest small business killer in Ontario, in history in Ontario.
Finally, someone is paying attention for what we are saying for many years.
Sweeping changes to the rules that govern your job. The Ontario government unveils its plan to hike the minimum wage, boost vacation time, and hold employers to account. We've been highlighting the troubles facing some workers in our CBC Toronto series, Hard at Work. Now, these changes come a week after a government commission report was released with more than 170 recommendations addressing precarious work. So exactly how will these changes affect you and your bank balance? Well, if you make general minimum wage, you'll be getting a big raise. It will jump from the current $11.40 per hour to $14 an hour by 2018 and $15 an hour by 2019. And if you are a part-time worker, you'll start making the same hourly wage as a full-timer. As for taking time off, everyone will get 10 personal emergency leave days. At least 2 of those must be paid. And after 5 years with the same employer, you'll get a bump in vacation time to 3 weeks a year. The idea of a $15 minimum wage has been around for a while now. A year ago, the NDP said they'd bring it in if they were elected. But Kathleen Wynne hasn't always been in favor. Back in January, she said she was happy with the status quo.
We came up with a system that actually depoliticizes the increases to the minimum wage. And so we see the minimum wage going up according to cost of living index. And that means that we don't have that debate in Ontario every single year. And so I think that is the responsible way to move forward.
So I had to ask her about that when I spoke to the Premier this afternoon and about the impacts this will have on small businesses.
As you know, as we implement the increase to $15, once the $15 is in place of January 1st, 2019, then in subsequent years we would go back to the cost of living increases. And there was always an intention when we brought in those first changes that there would be a review after 5 years. So I do think it's a good thing for businesses to know what the pattern is going to be and what they can expect. We're playing catch up right now because the workplace has changed so much, because the reality of people's jobs and the kinds of jobs that they're having to take on, they need to be able to look after themselves and look after their families, and that's why we're making this change.
Some of the critics are saying that these changes might make us less competitive. What do you have to say to them?
Well, what I know is that we will work with business. We've said that we will work with business. That's why we're phasing this in. There are other changes that we're putting in place in terms of scheduling and in terms of part-time and full-time work. Again, we know that people need to be able to look after their families, need to be able to buy the things that they need, and that supports Ontario businesses and the goods and services that they're selling.
What do you have to say to the Chamber of Commerce calling for an economic analysis of these proposed changes before they're implemented?
We'll work very closely with the Chamber of Commerce. I understand their concern, and it's what I said before. We know we need to work with small businesses, but there are many small businesses across the province that are already providing these resources for their employees. There were small business owners who were at the announcement this morning who have seen the advantage of paying a living wage, the retention of good workers, the stability that they've offered their employees has made their business more viable. So we'll continue to work with small businesses as we build this fair Ontario that we're talking about.
Fair, right? Fair workplaces, fair hydro plan, the Rental Fairness Act. The Liberals are keen on the word fair these days. So what message are they trying to drive to voters? We'll get some analysis from Queen's Park reporter Mike Crawley on that in about 20 minutes. There's a long list of workplace changes introduced today for workers. This could mean more cash in their pockets, but many employers are saying this is not good news. Shannon Martin joining me live now. And Shannon, we are getting an earful from some of those businesses.
Our inbox today at CBC Toronto was slammed from small business owners. A hairstylist inside the city saying he's going to have to pass on the increase to his customers, something he doesn't want to do. Outside the city, a small cafe saying it's going to be forced to shut its doors. It really sees no other option. Even here on King Street, I talked to a longtime business owner. He's been on this strip for 30 years. He says this new minimum wage increase is going to be a killer to small businesses.
It basically destroys a lot of fringe small businesses that are surviving barely sometimes. When you're talking about a slim profit margin of restaurants in our industry, a very competitive environment of 3 to 4%, her increases will probably, at the end of the day, some economists have actually looked at it right now, her minimum wage increase right now would erode completely the profitability of that restaurant, of an average restaurant in Ontario. That means that that restaurant will be in the red. Most businesses, if you increase menu pricing, you have a fight back by consumer because it's so competitive, they would have less sales, less volume of sales. There's only 3 or 4 businesses I can think of that increase prices annually and maintain profitability. Those would be the Toronto Maple Leafs, Air Canada, LCBO. We can't do that.
Where do you go from here? Do you see that you yourself surviving this?
I don't know. I mean, I have to look at it. I have to sit down with my staff, my management staff, and just say, take a look at it and see where to go from here. It's just that there's so little leeway that we have to increase pricing to cover the expense. I have to ask you coming to my restaurant to pay more. How much can I increase on my menu prices to cover the additional expense? I don't know. I have to sit down and seriously work it out.
So Fred Luck says he's crunching the numbers. Interesting, I went into about a dozen small businesses today, coffee shops, pizza shops, you name it. None of the business owners wanted to talk to me, and when I asked them how come, they said, listen, this is bad for me, but I also don't want to look like a bad guy to my employees, to my workers. Who did want to talk to us today, Dwight, is employees, the people who are going to be seeing an increase to their wage. We'll have more from them coming up a little later on in the show.
All right, get out of the rain. We'll check back with you later. Thank you, Shannon. Today's announcement comes on the heels of our CBC Toronto series on precarious employment called Hard at Work. Now, one of the workers we featured hadn't been paid by her employer for months. CBC Toronto has now learned that employer, Abira Healthcare, is the subject of many more unpaid wage complaints, filed as the company received millions in contracts from provincial and regional governments. So Stephanie Matisse is joining me now. And Stephanie, you found out that Abira isn't consistently paying contract workers in long-term care homes.
That's right, Dwight. We've had a number of therapists who've contacted CBC Toronto to say they've had issues getting paid. Abira Healthcare, that's the company, provides physio and occupational therapy in long-term care homes. It's owned by Danny Deanna and also operates as an Ontario holding company. And it has received contracts from Halton, York, Oxford County, and the province. And our investigation revealed that since 2013, the contracts total more than $4 million. Ebenezer Karabanan has been a physiotherapist at a long-term care facility in Milton for 11 years. As a contract worker, he invoices the service provider that holds the contract in Halton. For a few years, that was Abira Healthcare. He says his pay was sometimes late and extended to 45 days rather than monthly.
The problem was I was not able to pay my bills, right? I just couldn't manage. So I would dig into my line of credit. Sometimes his check would come, it would bounce. I would have to pay that fee. So interest upon interest upon interest, it was a loop. It just kept building and building, and I was so stressed out. I just couldn't, nights I couldn't sleep.
He says the issue persisted. The physiotherapist says he still owed more than $11,000 from Abira. He took the company to small claims court in March.
We were so scared. I don't know anything about suing. I don't know anything about the code system.
After settlement, the court ordered Abira to pay the full amount within 30 days. But more than a month after the deadline, he still hasn't been paid. Occupational therapist Debbie Branch resigned from Abira at the beginning of the year due to late pay and a bounced check signed by Danny Deanna.
I have yet to receive payment for those 6 weeks of work. It's just over $7,000. He receives an invoice from me every day, either by fax or by email.
Okay, I want you to
Occupational therapist Sandra Starr won a settlement from Abira in Barrie for $13,000 a year ago for unpaid wages. In its statement of defense, Abira denied it had ever made late payments.
Ready, steady, go. It seems to be a greater population of people that are not employees and that really have no recourse. If you're being treated poorly, if you're not being paid properly.
Starr was the first whistleblower to contact CBC Toronto about her experience. Deanna has since started legal proceedings to sue her for defamation. In addition to those whistleblowers, the Ministry of Labour has 18 Employment Standards Act complaints about Abira or Danny Deanna, and the majority are about unpaid wages. And in a 3-year period, the company was a defendant in 8 small claims cases, Dwight, that related either to contracts or rent. Deanna also declared bankruptcy in 2012.
What's he saying about all this? I'm sure we reached out to him.
Well, you can imagine I repeatedly asked for interviews with both him and his wife, Grace, who is the primary shareholder of the company, but through their lawyer, they declined.
Okay, so with all of this circling around them, how do they continue to get government contracts?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, York, Halton, and Oxford County all say that they paid Abira on time and that it's up to the service provider to fulfill its contract. And just in relation to the workplace rule changes that we've been covering today, there is a proposal to allow for the province to order money to be paid directly to an employee when there's money overdue or needs to be paid. And employers could also be forced to pay interest on those wages. That's one of the proposals that came up today. So that could be something that would have an impact on some of these workers that we heard from in this story.
Yeah, they sound like they need help. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Now, some of the people you saw in Steph's story, they reached out to us. So remember, if you have a story you'd like us to look into or a news tip for us to investigate, please just get in touch. Email us at torontotips@cbc.ca. A $15 minimum wage by 2019, pay equity between part-time and full-time workers. A lot of the new workplace rules unveiled by Kathleen Wynne today are about cold, hard cash, but a whole list of others focus on workers' rights. For instance, if your boss cancels your shift with less than 48 hours notice, you still get paid for 3 hours. And you can refuse to accept a shift with no repercussions if you're given less than 4 days notice. The plan would mean your employer also can't ask for a doctor's note if you take personal emergency leave. Now, the plan is called the Fair Workplaces Better Jobs Act, and fair is a word we're hearing a lot from Kathleen Wynne right now. Let's bring in Queen's Park reporter Mike Crawley. Mike, that's a political choice, correct?
Yes, well, fair workplaces. Before this, there was first the Fair Hydro Plan, then there was the Fair Housing Plan with rent control and the foreign buyers tax. Well, this particular move on workplaces has the potential to affect an awful lot of voters. 1.6 million people in this province earn $15 an hour or less. So basically, they are going to get a raise thanks to Kathleen Wynne. But as we heard earlier in the show, Kathleen Wynne was relatively recently, just in January, pretty cool to the idea of a $15 an hour minimum wage. This is something, though, that the NDP endorsed more than a year ago. So you can understand why NDP leader Andrea Horwath might be sounding a little bit cynical about the Liberals' motives.
For us, you know, labor law reform and a $15 minimum wage is not an election ploy. That's what we believe in. So for the Liberals, after 14 years finally doing something, it's quite interesting, and it shows me, and I think it's clear to the people of Ontario, that for Liberals it's always about them. It's always about them and their own political fortunes and what works for them politically, while for 14 years they've done nothing.
NDP leader Andrea Horwath even went so far as to say that Kathleen Wynne only really cares about something when it's got to do with her political fortunes. Dwight?
All right, Mike, so where are the PCs on this?
That is a really good question. We put that to Patrick Brown in a scrum today, asked him several times if he becomes premier, which he could next June, will he keep this idea of raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour? Does he endorse it? No idea. He says he wants to wait and see a cost-benefit analysis from the Liberals. Here's Patrick Brown.
It's standard practice to provide a cost-benefit analysis. That hasn't happened, and we want to be absolutely sure this is not going to diminish our ability to have job creation in the province of Ontario.
So Patrick Brown, though, did quip that he can understand why there might be a need for higher wages because after 14 years of Liberal government, things have become a lot more unaffordable here in Ontario. But this kind of sets the stage for what could potentially be an election issue. Where do the various parties stand on the idea of a $15 minimum wage? The Liberals may have lobbed a little hand grenade Patrick Brown's way. Dwight?
Yeah, it seems like they're carving out a little space in the middle there, as per usual. Thank you, Mike.
You're welcome.
The plan includes 10 personal emergency leave days per year, but only 2 of them need to be paid. And I asked Kathleen Wynne about that decision when I spoke to her today.
Looked at what the recommendation was to have more paid sick days. And we said, you know what, we think there need to be 10 days that someone can have off that are for their personal emergency leave. Yeah. 2 of them will be paid. We're leaders in the country in terms of paid sick days, so is it enough? We'll continue to assess that. One of the challenges with this review, Dwight, is that it hadn't been done for many, many years. And what the minister and I have talked about is that there has to be an ongoing discussion about the workplace. And we can't leave it another 20 years before we do that review. So we're taking a leadership role on many of these items, and we'll continue to assess them.
So how are workers responding to all of this? Let's head back to Shannon Martin near King and John tonight. And what are you hearing, Shannon?
Well, the first worker we talked to represents a lot of people. She works 4 jobs. So she works in a food factory, she paints, she cleans. Nothing is permanent. So she's basically living paycheck to paycheck. Today, she says, for her, obviously is a good day. Here's more from her.
Finally, the government hear what the employers in Ontario, we was telling them long time ago. I feel like finally we can start talking in real numbers of what's mean surviving in this city with a minimum wage that should provide us the minimum salary to pay your bills. So now I feel like with $15 by hours, I can pay my rent, food, and transportation. That is the basic for myself to survive. That made me happy, of course. It's not all that I want. It's not all what I deserve, but it's a good start.
Yeah, those are some good points. As we mentioned before, we talked to a lot of workers as part of our Hard at Work series, and you reached out to one of them today for her reaction.
Yes, we profiled a woman named Victoria Muir. She's on sick leave from the city of Toronto. So she was working full-time hours, but on a part-time collective agreement. After 10 years of part-time temporary work, so no benefits, no sick pay, she suffered a mental breakdown. Today we went back to her to see what she thinks about these changes. She says there is a big piece missing here. Here's more from Victoria Muir.
We are headed for a very, very dangerous future, I think. And I think we need to change our workplace models. And it's disappointing that Ontario hasn't taken the leadership to change our workplace models. And it's not just about what's on paper and what's on policy. I was really excited when I saw this review, but they haven't said anything about enforcement tools for non-compliant employers, for supporting mental health, for supporting families, nothing, right? So it's pretty disappointing, and it actually makes me feel pretty hopeless. I've been in this situation for over 5 years, and I don't see a light at the end of the tunnel.
So she's still off work. She is still fighting with the city of Toronto. We've got her full story as part of our Hard at Work series on our CBC Toronto website. It's a compelling one if you want to read it. But Dwight, her message today says clearly, precarious workers like her need the supports. She feels that this doesn't go nearly far enough.
Yeah, thank you for that, Shannon. As Shannon mentioned, for a full list of the workplace changes and more in our Hard at Work series, just go to our website, cbc.ca/Toronto.